Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the third episode of the Pleasure for Pleasers podcast. Today we are meeting with a very special guest. His name is Dr. Christopher Wilson. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yes. So today we are going to talk about the patriarchy and specifically how the patriarchy negatively impacts men. But before we do that, Chris, will you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, so my name's Chris Wilson. I am a doctorate of human sexuality. I graduated from Widener University in 2017. I also have a master's degree in education from Widener, as well as a master's of family therapy from Jefferson University. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, a AMFT approved supervisor and clinical fellow, and an ASEX certified sex therapist and supervisor. And for those who don't know, ASEX stands for the American Association of Sexual Educators, Counselors, and Therapists.
Wonderful. And you are based in Philadelphia, is that correct?
Yeah, so I'm based in Philadelphia. I have a team of other wonderful clinicians that work with me. Collectively, we're known as the Center for Healthier Relationships, Individuals, and Sexualities. And we are in the land title building of Philadelphia, just south of City Hall. So like right on Broad Street, which is a great location.
Awesome. And before we kind of jump into the content, is there a particular population that you see in your practice or specific presenting problems?
Yeah, so the entire team, we're all made of LGBTQ individuals. So we are all part of the community. So we serve that community as a specialty. But obviously, we work with people of a variety of different backgrounds, people of color, people not of color, people who are straight, people who are not straight, cisgender, non-cisgender. I specialize specifically in sex therapy in working with men in particular, or even male socialized people, so people who don't necessarily identify as male, but they have that social construct of a male person, or people who were not assigned male at birth, but identify as male. And so those tend to be my populations that I work with the most.
Wonderful. Okay, great. And I have to ask before we get started, because we're talking about the patriarchy, did you see the Barbie movie?
I did see the Barbie movie. Um,
Would-
it was fantastic in many respects. I honestly thought they could have gone further even, and really drove home, particularly towards the ending of it. Like, I don't want to give anything away for those who haven't seen it, but I think they could have even pushed harder on what they were going to give the Ken of the Barbie world.
Yes, yes, awesome. I loved it. I loved and the soundtrack, I just can't get it out of my head. So so let's jump in. So what is the patriarchy? How would you define it?
So, well, I'll start with Merriam-Webster dictionary definition, and then I'll kind of talk about my own. So, their definition is a social organization marked by the supremacy of the father in the clan or family, the legal dependency of wives and children, and the reckoning of descent and inheritance in the male line. And they more broadly define it as control by men of a disproportionate large share of power. But the way I would define it is a society in which men have control. Simply put, they have power and they use that power towards their advantage.
Okay, okay. And so how would you say the patriarchy, who does it hurt? Let's start there.
Arguably, the people it hurts the most are women, and this includes cisgendered women and trans women. And I'll kind of come back to trans women because it's kind of a unique heart pain there. But in general, women, one of the, basic examples I can think of in US culture is that women did not have the right to vote in this country until 104 years ago. Literally, we have people who are alive today that are older than women's ability to have voting rights in this country. The idea that women couldn't get any credit or loans until 1974. Literally, we are hitting the 50-year anniversary of women being able to have the right to have their own financial freedom. One of my favorite stories, not in the sense that that's a good story, but it's kind of a sad reality, was the woman who created Mrs. Fields, actually had to have her husband co-sign for her first little stand that she did in a mall. And so had he not co-signed for her, her business never would have happened. We wouldn't have the delicious Mrs. Fields cookies we have today, and she wouldn't be, I'm sure she's a multimillionaire at this point. And the reality is that wouldn't have existed if he hadn't co-signed for her. So not nothing giving him the credit for that, but just acknowledging that's where we were at in the law at the time. And that's the sad reality. I'm 43, so that literally happened 7 years before I was born. My oldest biological sibling is 50 this year, so it was literally the year he was born. And so it's wild to me to think that women didn't have legal access to their own money, at least in the form of loans and the form of credit, until 1974. It's just wild. The other main populations it really hurts are people of color. We typically think of those folks as what it's oftentimes called BIPOC folks. And that's because in general, and we'll get to this in a moment, but in general, the people who hold the most power in the patriarchy are white cisgendered men. And cisgendered, for those who don't know, just means that you identify as the gender which you were assigned at birth. And so if you were somebody who is a person of color, you might still have some patriarchal advantage if you are a male identified or male socialized person. But if you're a person of color, because you're not part of that larger white schema, you are likely going to be othered in some way.
Mhm.
And finally, the last community I would say that gets hurt the worst is the LGBTQ community. I'm not saying worse than women, but just worse in terms of general being a large conglomerate of people that are hurt because of their identities. And within that community, we could argue that trans women in particular are hurt even more so than probably anyone else in that community, in part because in some ways they've given up their privilege as a male assigned person, and as they accept their femininity and their womanhood, they are now considered other or less than in a patriarchal driven society. And a lot of people do oftentimes see trans people as less than, which is really sad and disheartening.
Yeah, that is really sad. And wow, with that like perspective in terms of the timeline, the story about Mrs. Fields, um, it is wild.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so I always, when I talk about the patriarchy, to me it's so insidious. We don't even necessarily notice all the ways in which it's holding people back. We don't even always see that women still don't have the same equality that men do, at least in our country and arguably most countries in this world. Um, and it's still really hard for women to catch up. They've only had like the access to finances for 50 years. Like when you've only had that access for 50 years, it's really hard to be considered equal in that way.
Mhm, mhm. Absolutely. I so appreciate what you're saying. And I just love to tie in terms of like the pleasure for pleasers community in terms of
Yeah.
trying to overcome people pleasing and perfectionistic sexuality for women. A lot of the messages that we address in the program and we're trying to overcome is stay small and passive, be empathic and nurturing, be selfless, be sexually performative, or be seen and treated as an object.
Yeah, most definitely. A lot of women, unfortunately, think that sex is for men. I remember I was teaching a course at King University, and I had, one of the questions was like, how do you know, I was giving on a test with, how do you know when sex is done? And one of the young ladies in my class said, when the man finishes. And I was like, oh, that's painful. Like, I'm a male socialized person. I happen to be married to a man. And I still find that like to be a painful response to hear, because like, no, I want you to have pleasure. Like I want every person, regardless of gender or sex, to enjoy sexual experiences if they want that.
Mm.
And that I think should be empowered for everybody. And we can also talk about how like, it sounds like the work you're doing a lot has to do with like women-centered pleasure. I also find that, and we can talk about this in a moment, like the patriarchy also holds men back from pleasure in some ways too.
Oh my gosh, I'd love to. Let's keep going so that we can get to that part.
Yeah,
So,
certainly.
who does the patriarchy benefit then, would you say?
Hands down, white cisgendered men.
Mm.
But arguably, any person who is a male person or male assigned person is going to benefit from it to some extent. So even though I am not a heterosexual person, I still benefit because I am a white person. I am a male socialite person. I present male in most walks of life. So for that reason, I benefit. I can go into those spaces where sometimes women or people who are, trans might not be able to go into in a way that I can. And of course, there's spaces where I'm not comfortable too, right? So there are places where, as a queer person, I'm not going to feel as comfortable in a room full of straight cis white men, the same way that another straight cis white man might. And so because of that, they inherently hold the power. If we look at our political system, for instance, every president we've ever had has been male. That
Mm,
is one of the best examples of the patriarchy right there.
hmm.
Every single one is male. If we look at our Supreme Court, while we have a much more diverse court than we've ever probably had, there's still more males than females at this time. We most have always been white. We have some exceptions to that now, which is great, but for a long time they were all white. And so they've held all the power. If we look at the people with the most money in this country, Elon Musk, um, Ted Turner, uh, Mark Zuckerberg, all white cis men, and they help each other out. That's just a
Hmm.
reality. And because of that, that system of power plays into everything they do. I actually am working with a client, can't say much, but I'm working with a client who is a cis male and white, but he's part of the queer community and has recognized that like his sense of being connected to the larger people in his work sphere is like he can't really be his full self because the upper white cis men who run the organization he works for are in control, and they don't feel comfortable with him being fully acknowledged in the same way that they would acknowledge their spouses or their lives as straight cis white men. So it's interesting to see, even as a queer person, like how there can be a nuance between white cis straight men versus all other men, even, if you're not white or if you're not straight, or cisgender, like there's definitely levels of oppression even within that community, which is a very interesting dynamic to kind of recognize. Even myself as a 40 something year old man, I find myself, even unfortunately, because we're all socialized under this, holding some of those views and having to stop myself and really push myself and go, nope, that's not comfortable, that's not okay, just because this is a social message you've been given.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, it reminds me of like the intersectionality of our social identities, and some are privileged and some are oppressed, and how that impacts how we take up space, and in certain contexts we can be more ourselves, and in other contexts we can't. And then how we hold and negotiate power too.
Yeah, most certainly. And arguably speaking, there are probably ways in which men socially orchestrate power as well as support each other with power and also bargain about power. Who's going to have that power even within our male community, right? And usually white cis men control most of that. And they might give a little bit out to people of color that are males and a little bit out to people who are queer that are male. But then, we're going to put everybody else on the other side. They don't get to have that same level of privilege.
Yeah. And that's how this system is set up and maintained, right? It's like the whole point is to sort of allocate and maintain this like significant disparity in power.
Yeah, and you and I were even talking just briefly before we jumped on about the fact that like there are a lot of people who don't even question the system in which they're in, and so they don't even necessarily think, "Oh, hey, I need to question like why is it all white men who are in this position of power, say at a school board or at a industry job, they don't even question it because it's always been that way, and so there's a sense of like, well, it's always been that way, so shouldn't we continue it?" I would argue part of the reason maybe we have the alt-right movement of men is in part because there's a loss of power happening for them. These cis white het men are finally not getting all the power. And for that reason, they're like, oh, well, we want to try to claw it back. Instead of going, oh, hey, there's actually some good that can come out of this. And we can actually be connected to a world that's different than our own. And I think that's just really hard for them, unfortunately.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, when I think about the alternative, I think about opportunity and freedom. So and liberation. Um,
Certainly.
yeah. Okay. So can white cis het men, can they be disadvantaged by the
Oh,
patriarchy?
certainly. Without a doubt. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, it's a very insidious process, and I don't think that most white cis straight men would even necessarily acknowledge that some of these things are actually problematic for them. at least not in a broader context. They talk to me about it because I'm another male socialized person, and they can feel comfortable with that. And they can go, oh, hey, here's some areas of my life that I don't feel great about as if this white straight man, or maybe not even exclusively straight. Sometimes they're coming into my office because they're trying to figure that out. They're like, I don't necessarily know if I identify as straight, or they're coming into my office because they're not sure if they necessarily identify as cisgender. And maybe they have something that's a little bit more gender variant in themselves, and they're trying to express that. I would argue that there's kind of four main areas in which men in the patriarchal system typically get hurt, and that emotional expression, gender expression, sexuality, and body image. And as I said before, like it's so subversive in ways in which we don't even necessarily recognize that we end up supporting without even trying. And it's kind of it's sad to me of somebody who is male socialized and works with this population a lot, because they're just in pain and they don't even know that other people feel this pain.
Sure, sure. Would you be able to give with one of those 4 areas, an example? I'm kinda thinking about examples in terms of, like, the couples therapy work that I do, but could you, like, break it down for us just so that we could kinda walk through an example?
Yeah, one of my favorite examples ever is I had a client, and I've actually had a couple clients like this, but I'm thinking of a couple I worked with, where one of the partners in the couple who was male said, "I don't have emotions." Like at the start of our session and start of our work, it was like, "I don't have emotions." Nope, nope. You have emotions. We just don't know how to connect to them yet, and that's okay. You've been taught by our society that you don't have emotion, that you should push it down. And so over time and through the work that we did, like really was able to connect with their emotion in a way that was really beautiful to see as a clinician. And what was interesting is their wife then had to learn how to like accept that he had emotions, and it was a very interesting experience for her because she was like, "Wait, his emotions aren't the same as mine." Nope, he gets to have his own experiences of emotions and feelings, and he can have different perspectives than you. And we want him to be able to voice that. And it took some time for her to get comfortable with that. Of like, oh yeah, I wanted this, and now I'm getting it. Um, I can also think about it like, and think about a sexuality standpoint. I can think of a lot of males I've worked with who feel like a pressure to like live up to some ideal standards of what men are supposed to be as sexual beings. And so if they're not aggressive or assertive, and they're not initiating often, a lot of times their female partners in particular will feel like, oh, well, I'm not attractive. He doesn't want me. He doesn't desire me. Like,
Mhm.
no, maybe there's something else going on. A lot of times when I work with the men one-on-one, they'll tell me it's not about attraction towards their spouse. They usually find their spouses attractive. It's more oftentimes than not, they're tired, they're exhausted,
Mm.
they are stressed out by finances, they are stressed out that the baby's going to come in the room. Like, there's these things that like hold them back, and so they don't initiate or they don't want to engage, and that creates, unfortunately, a toxic situation in the relationship because they're holding back. Their female partners are expecting them to be the one who initiates, and going back to your concept around empowerment for women, I actually empower my female clients to try to initiate more, try to be the person who pursues as well. I want it to be both ways, like males pursue, women pursue. We're talking about cisgender individuals, but I really do try to get like what feels like comfortable for the couple. And a lot of times it's more like the female partner might pursue like 20% of the time, or something like that works for them. And the man does usually like to have that role of the pursuer most of the time. But every now and then, he wants to have a little bit of that being pursued too. It helps feel a sense of validation. Men oftentimes talk to me about wanting to feel attractive, and their spouse is not actually, not giving that to them, and not telling them when they think that they're attractive or handsome or whatever. One of my clients once said something to the effect of, I want them to slap my ass and tell me I'm pretty."
Mhm.
And it's just kind of a funny, and this was a male client, and it was just a funny moment of like, yeah, like you want that validation for feeling attractive and feeling loved and feeling cared for, and we just don't teach men how to do that. Going back to that emotional expression piece, they're all tied in together, right? Like, so he wants to feel attractive. That's kind of connected to the body image piece. He wants to feel like he can be a sexual person and be pursued, but also be pursued. And he wants to be able to express himself in different ways, both from a gender expression standpoint and a emotional expression standpoint. And we don't give that in the society. And part of that because the patriarchy, that's this white male perspective, constantly said, nope, we're not supposed to step outside of our little box here, guys. And when they do, they're usually blasted. And I can think of a whole bunch of different stories where, men tried to, or maybe they didn't decide to step out of it, and there was negative consequences for that.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. There's so much to unpack just in what you said. It makes me feel like it makes me pause and it makes me feel like when we think about privilege and oppression, like it's like I feel privileged when I can talk about like and I fully express myself emotionally and I never have to worry about like, being negatively perceived. And it feels so, from your descript like so restrictive in our self-expression and we, staying into this box and having the pressure of this like external focus on providing and it feels so limited. And so I guess my question for you is like, if people don't know any different, what do they start to feel when they are able to, connect to their emotions, when they are able to express themselves in various ways, and not so much of that dichotomy? What can they hope to feel, and how does it change their life? What can they look forward to?
I mean, I think in therapy, particularly cis white straight men learn how, and men in general, regardless of sexual orientation or even gender, assigned gender, learn to kind of connect with emotions that are there. And at first, it's trying to figure out identifying an emotion, like what is something other than anger. Like oftentimes, men know how to feel anger, they know how to feel frustration. These are emotions that we actually let men feel openly. I've actually had men talk about the fact that like they can't actually express emotions unless it's anger or extreme grief under extreme circumstances. So like they
Mhm.
lose a loved one, they're allowed to cry. But or maybe the sports team loses and they're allowed to like, cry, but usually it's more they're allowed to throw things. It's that's it. Like those are the extremes. Nothing else. Maybe they can express happiness and joy, but heaven forbid we're talking about exhaustion or we're talking about grief or we're talking about feeling down on ourselves. Those are just things that are not typically accessible for men and oftentimes not supported by our largest society, both not supported by men, but also not supported by women. I've actually had clients say like they try to express their emotions and their partners don't want to hear it.
Mhm.
And that's really hard for them. Um, so through the process of therapy, men first start to recognize they have emotions, then they kind of start to recognize what those emotions are, and then eventually they start to actually be able to express the emotion. There's a sometimes a therapeutic tool we use called the iceberg analogy, and it's like we see a little bit of tip of the what's going on, and the rest of it underneath. And for a lot of men, anger and frustration are at the top of that iceberg, but all the other feelings are all below that. And so in the work, they start going, oh, I can now see the next layer down, what's underneath that iceberg. And eventually they're like able to see a vast majority. I would argue that regardless of how much therapy people do, most men are still probably not going to be at the same level that most women are. And part of that has to do with socialization. And some of that could also be related to biology. We know that from studies that look at socialization of trans men, they'll talk about the fact that like after they are passing, which means that people read them as male, they aren't given the same space to talk about their emotions the same way they were when they were assigned and read as female. And some of it can also be connected to the changes of biology. So if they're on testosterone, there's an argument to be made for testosterone stunts or maybe blunts our emotional affect. Maybe it's part of the reason that we tend to be more angry and frustrated than the other emotions. And so, I don't expect men to all of a sudden be on testosterone blockers so they can access their emotions. That would be kind of absurd. But it is something to be said for like, yeah, let's start learning and diving into that and feeling what the complexity is there, which is not always easy for a lot of men to do.
Yeah.
Um, I've often talked about like I'll cite myself as an example. I can think back to being like a like early pubertal boy, like somewhere between like fourth grade and sixth grade, and starting to recognize the world expected me to push my emotions down, that it was not okay for me to cry.
Mm.
Um, excuse me. And it was very clear by the time I got to like sixth, seventh grade, like, nope, boys do not cry. I have I have several nephews, two of which are now adults. One is a teenager, and I remember there being a comment about like my one nephew about him being too emotional, and it's like, no, no, we want him to be emotional. We want him to connect with emotion. Let him be that person who has feelings. I also remember. Did you ever have a class with Betsy Crane when we were in school together?
I did.
I remember her talking about the fact that like when she was raising her son, that she did a really great job of trying to give him like more of that feminist blend and raise him to be a really nice guy. And he talked about the fact that it was really hard for him dating, like, or she would, I should say, she shared. He would talk about the fact that it was hard for him to date initially because women wanted the bad guy. They wanted the guys that were not good for them, and he was this nice, sweet guy. And it took a while for him to figure out the right person for him. And I think that there's something to be said about patriarchy with that too, right? We kind of socialize women to want the bad guy or, to change men. And that's probably another one layer in which women are kind of not helped by the patriarchy. But, I think it also doesn't help men too. It teaches men to expect women to be the caretakers for them. It teaches men to expect women to be the emotional caretakers for them in particular. Todd Reiser in his books argues that men are oftentimes going to women to solve their issues. And so if they have another issue with another male, they go to a female to help them navigate that because they don't know how to talk to each other about their emotions. So we'll go here to the expert on emotionality, which is a female.
Yeah. And it just continues to like strengthen the binary of men, like the isolation. I would imagine those are my words, but when I put myself in those shoes and I think about, well, what would it be like to have such a limited range of emotional expression? And if I were to go outside that box, I could experience a microaggression or negative treatment from society, all of these other disadvantages that are just going to put me right back in, where I started. So you've got the isolation and the loneliness, and then you've got and again, I don't know, maybe you can speak to whether or not that's accurate. And then the women, like what you're saying with like the mental labor. And when I think about couple therapy in particular, as we make bids for connection, requests for comfort, support, care, the difference between feeling validated and connected and to have a space that's sacred versus feeling invalidated or just even more space in between the two partners. I mean, there's just my brain is just kind of like thinking of so many things based on what you just said.
Yeah, I've seen from a couple different clients where when the male partner starts to speak up, it's like, well, that's not right. He's not telling the right story. He's not telling the right emotion. Oh,
Mhm.
he's just not feeling your emotion. He
Mhm.
has a different emotional experience, and that's okay. I've also worked with a number of males who at first came into my office thinking that they might be gay or they might be trans. And as we started processing, it wasn't that for them. They weren't attracted to men. They weren't bisexual. They weren't trans. What it was, they were men that didn't hold to this really hard, rigid gender norms. And
Mhm.
so they started going, oh, it's okay to not necessarily have to be in this little tiny box of rigidity around maleness. I can, with one of my clients, I could wear a dangly earring and rock that really proudly or rock a dress and feel really comfortable with that because what that client wanted. When they first started working with me, they weren't really sure if maybe they were genderqueer or if they were trans. And as we started really talking about it, it was really just like they loved presenting in like this, for lack of a better term, gender fuck kind of way of like having a beard and having dangly earrings and really cool dresses, had really good fashion sense. Uh, you know, and it wasn't about orientation or gender. It was just them and being honest, just thinking back to like, I can think back to like my grandparents were boomers and or not sorry, my parents are boomers, my grandparents were silent generation. And the idea that women would have worn pants back then was so like progressive and like what, and I think we're kind of there with males that are or these people who are male socialized. That the idea that wearing a dress would be like such a moment, people blasted Harry Styles for wearing a dress on the cover of a magazine. And it's the man who has dated some of the most beautiful women in the world, has, adhered to many male socialized standards of norms. And yet he did something outside the box and the trolls of the internet like went after him. And hat tip to him, because he like just kind of like, yeah, say what you want, I don't care. And I would argue that part of that comes from the fact that he is as far as I know, this white male who also happens to be very financially affluent. So, he probably can take all those things, and be okay with it because he has all those layers of privilege.
Yes, yes. Oh my gosh. So two things keep, popping up for me as you talk about this in terms of my own work. What comes up is self-compassion. It's like when we're in
Mm,
interpersonal relationships and we think about emotional expression and we think about connecting with and communicating our emotions. One of the things that I observe over and over and over again is it's hard to provide that type of emotional support if we're not self-compassionate ourselves, if we don't have the permission to
yeah,
be able to be kind to ourselves, to be able to connect it and normalize like the hardships that we go through. If we can't talk about it, how can we normalize it? And then, to just hold space for that. So the self-compassion thing comes up. And then the other thing that comes up is like, I'm just being reminded by this conversation how hard it is to sort of rise above the patriarchy and how much work is required. I mean, with pleasure for pleasers, with myself, just in my own personal life, like, building that self-awareness, like having that self-compassion, recognizing when sexist microaggressions are happening and not allowing that to impact my identity development or how I feel about myself. I mean, it's hard. It's hard work.
yeah. I mean, I'm 43. I'm still evolving. I'm still growing. I definitely make mistakes in my own life. I think that, when you were saying that, it made me think of like grief as a construct and like how oftentimes we give more grace for women to grieve. And a lot of times men aren't given that same grace. And it's like, well, you put your so-and-so in the ground, so get back to work. And part of that's our capitalist society. I'm not going to go into a diatribe on that, but I think there is just more space for men, or sorry, more space for women to have that grace around grief, even, which is one of probably our hardest emotions as humans to deal with. And men just aren't given that same invitation to talk about it. I worked with a couple once where they had unfortunately lost a child at birth or shortly thereafter, and the female partner came in to see me initially, and we did mostly individual work, but then we transitioned to doing some couples work for a little while, and then I worked with the husband for a little bit. But his sense of ability to go to others and talk about his emotions, he just couldn't do it. He would go to like the woods and like scream and do the other things silently because the world wasn't telling him it was okay. But the
Mhm.
world was saying to the female partner, it's okay that you're sad. It's okay that you grieve that you lost your child. But he wasn't given that same space in the larger community that they had.
Yeah, and I could just imagine the recoil, right? It's like you grieve, but then like the recoil because society just it doesn't reward you for you're actually punished probably for expressing those feelings. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, wow, wow. I mean, I have so many more questions, but I want to make sure that we get through this.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so let's see here. Um, Anything else about, so we talked about emotional expression, we talked about gender expression, we talked about sexuality in terms of like initiation and self-expression, and then body image. Anything important about body image that you want to speak to?
Oh, a lot. I could totally spend like a good chunk of time talking about this, but I think a big part of it is just recognizing that men have become increasingly aware of their body state and what they're supposed to be in our society. We have like the Chris's of the Marvel world, right? So we have Chris Hemsworth, Chris Evans, Chris Pine. I don't know why they're all Chris's, but they are. Uh, you know, and they all have these really idealistic bodies, and a lot of young men really feel pressured to have that kind of idealized body in many respects. I did my doctoral dissertation on gay male body image, and the research in general said, at least at that time, that gay men and cis straight women, or not straight, sorry, well, yeah, cis straight women, arguably had the worst body satisfaction amongst different groups. But what was also very prevalent is that cis white straight men were also gaining on traction on having body dissatisfaction. And I would argue that it's probably actually more prevalent than we even acknowledge because of the fact that men aren't allowed to speak about their body image concerns. I work with a lot of men who get really worried about like having too much body fat or not being muscular enough, which is usually the paradigm that a lot of men feel like they have to adhere to, which is that lean muscular look. But they also come in worrying about their penis size, and a lot of times their penis size is perfectly normal, but they feel like they're supposed to have like a 10-inch penis. I was like, nope, that is like a porn star's penis, and very few porn stars even have that size of a penis. Like, that's just not normal. Most men fall somewhere between 5 and 6 inches, depending on what study you're looking at. And so they get really caught up in their head, and sometimes even giving them that education around that still doesn't really squash that little part of themselves that goes, oh, I'm not man enough because I don't have this. Because again, that patriarchal message is that men are supposed to have these huge, enormous penises. The penis is the center of our world. It is the center of our pleasure source. And it's like, no, we can get a lot of other pleasure in a lot of other ways than just our penis. I always think back to there's an entire garden of statues of penises, and the fact that like someone decided that was something they were going to create in our world, thinking that like that was an important thing, just
Mhm.
kind of talk to the patriarchy and the power the patriarchy had, like this idea that this body part carries so much about our masculinity, and they're like, hey, we're going to erect an entire park with statues of the penis. Um, even if we go back to like the time of Pompeii, like you can look at artwork where like the penises were overly embellished in the artwork, and it was just like, whoa, like that shows how much they were really fixated on that even at that time. It's just kind of wild to think like we have a world, applaud that at such a high standard of being, and men feel so much pressure to adhere to that. Even if we look back to like the Greek statues, a lot of times the men weren't well endowed at all, but he means they were actually usually under endowed, but their bodies were these idyllic, you know, looks to them. If you look at the statues, I can't think of one male statue that I've ever seen from that time period where the men didn't look like, what we picture Hercules to look like, that extraordinarily musculature, big, brooding man. They all look like that. Even David, Michelangelo David, arguably speaking, probably one of the thinner men of of those lovely statues, and even he, it's still like could be a Calvin Klein model.
Yes. That is so ironic because I studied in Greece and studied abroad in Greece, and that's where I decided I wanted to be a sex therapist because I felt so liberated by open sexual expression. But again, like in terms of like from a privilege standpoint, it didn't hit me the same way, right? You're absolutely right about the statues. And that's so interesting. And the other thing I'm thinking about is with pleasure for pleasure. So the other part is perfectionistic sexuality, and a lot of it talks about the research, particularly with women, is when we're thinking about these ideal body types, right? We become more, we engage in what's called self-objectification, right? Like we
Mhm.
see ourselves.
Body scanning behaviors. Yep.
Yes, through the eyes of someone else instead of experiencing the world through our own first person perspective. And it's actually like a dissociative process, right? So like when we're engaging in sexual play, we're not actually feeling, we're not embodied, we're not feeling the pleasure because we're dissociating into like this what if, what could be, what might be in terms of fears of rejection and inadequacy. Is that similar to men as well in terms of like how body image can impact sex or?
I would say for gay men and bi men, probably more so than straight men,
Okay.
but in a different way. So if we think about like the male gaze, right, the idea that men are objectifying women is how it's typically been seen. And we have imagery of this, like even something as simple as like Megan Fox opening the hood of the car in Transformers, and she's like in this very skimpy outfit, right? And so men are like viewing that and putting themselves in the role of Shia LaBeouf and excited about that. I would argue that straight men don't necessarily have the same body scanning behavior when they come across women that men who are interested in other men might, or women might who are interested in men. But they do compare themselves to other men, like in the locker room or in the gym. Like I go to a gym that happens to be a lot of young college males because it just happens to be near a lot of colleges, and you'll constantly see the guy take pictures of themselves in selfies. They'll be flexing. They're clearly very body conscious. They, talk about the fact that they're struggling with their own body image. And what I'd love to see in this younger generation is I don't love to see that they seemingly have a lot of body image issues, what I do like to see is I do hear these little conversation points where they're clearly talking to each other about their insecurities. And that's really cool to see in this younger population of people, these 20 somethings. I cannot honestly say that that did not happen when I was their age. So to see like 20 years later, these young men talking about how they feel like, oh, I'm fat, or oh, I'm this, and their friends are supporting them. And like, unfortunately, they're somewhat supporting them unhealthy in terms of like trying to get them to look a particular way, but they're still like hearing them out. They're still listening to them. They're still validating that, which is something that I think this younger generation of men are connecting with, which is really awesome.
That is really awesome. What a nice surprise. I would think that like I'm very worried about the younger generations when it comes to social media and just, but that is so nice to hear that there's a little bit more openness. Oh, well, I mean, I could talk to you for at least another hour, but I know that our hour is up. I would love
Yeah.
for you to just plug in if you have anything, like in terms of your work, like if people want to follow you, like how do they get a hold of you? What can they look
Yeah.
for?
So I'm going to be presenting on this topic actually at the American Men's Studies Association in June. But people can also find more information about me on my website, which is chriswilsonphd.com. They can find more information about me on my center's website, which is centerforhealthierrelationships.com. I also have a Instagram, which is Chris Wilson PhD, and a Facebook page for the Center for Healthier Relationships, Individuals, and Sexuality. So it can be found in all these different platforms, and people can email me or call me if they have any questions, or even if they want to say, "Hey, you got any resources for this?" Because I am a big believer that part of my job as a therapist and educator is literally just helping people get to the right resources, whether that is like an article or that is a book. Um, and for those who want to read more about male body image in particular, the Adonis Complex is a really good book on male body image. I disagree with the authors, at least in some of their original assumptions around gay men not having worse body issues, because the research says otherwise. But I haven't had a chance to read their most updated version, so maybe they course corrected that, because the older version about 20 years old, I think, if I remember correctly.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, we definitely need your work. You are welcome back here anytime. So
Happy to come back.
yes, thank you so much. We really appreciate all that you've shared with us today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, yes. All right. Well, you take care.
You too.
Okay.